Hello and welcome to the 16th edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is something that might make you think twice the next time you unwrap a package shipped from overseas or savour fruit that's been transported across the globe. We're talking about the recent moves in the global shipping industry to become more sustainable. You might be thinking, shipping? Sounds dry. Yet shipping is the hidden circulatory system of our global economy, responsible for about 90% of the world's trade by volume. Without it, the vast bulk of goods simply wouldn't move from one continent to another. It's a staggering enterprise, but there's a catch. Shipping is also responsible for around 3% of global carbon emissions, which is roughly on par with some major industrialised nations if we treated international shipping as a country of its own. No small footprint for these mammoth vessels hauling everything from steel to sneakers. For decades, the maritime sector flew a bit under the radar in climate negotiations. It wasn't included in the Paris Agreement. It wasn't singled out as a must-tackle source of emissions like power plants or cars. Instead, it had its own forum, the International Maritime Organization, a United Nations agency charged with overseeing shipping. With so many different nations relying on maritime trade in different ways, the question of how to curb pollution from massive ocean-going vessels turned into a decade-long saga that involved negotiations so slow and stubborn they could rival the turning radius of a supertanker. Yet, after 10 years of talks and some serious wrangling, there is at last a set of internationally mandated targets to reduce shipping emissions. It stands as a landmark moment because shipping just became the first global industry with internationally agreed upon rules for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. That alone is a big deal. Specifically, the new agreement sets a formal goal of cutting emissions at least 20% by 2030 and charting a course toward net zero by around 2050. It also establishes a requirement for large commercial ships to start improving their fuel mix as soon as 2028, with a penalty of $380 per metric ton of excess carbon emitted. Some critics see this penalty as not high enough to force dramatic change, while others believe it's an overdue but positive sign that shipping is finally getting serious. Either way, it marks a tangible shift away from bunker fuel, that heavy sludge-like oil that's historically propelled most large cargo ships, toward cleaner alternatives like liquefied natural gas, methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, or even hybrid electric propulsion. There's a sense in the industry that what was once a fringe conversation is becoming more mainstream, with more shipping firms looking at retrofit options or brand new vessels designed for alternative fuels. Still, it's taken a good decade to arrive at this moment, and it didn't come together without controversy. At the International Maritime Organization, some countries were pushing for more ambitious targets, closer to 50% reduction by 2030, to stay aligned with broader global climate aims. Others, typically those with large shipping registries or significant export economies, were concerned about the economic consequences of aggressive rules, believing higher costs could drive up the price of goods or reduce trade competitiveness. The final compromise was that 20% figure for 2030, which many environmental groups have critiqued as too little too late. And then there's the question of how we pay for all this. Critics say the deal doesn't explicitly guarantee funding to develop the necessary infrastructure, so it's still not clear if these policies alone will generate enough investment to support, for example, the port facilities needed to fuel ships with ammonia or hydrogen. Skeptics argue that you can't decarbonise shipping just by waving a magic policy wand. You need massive R&D, new fueling stations, new vessel designs, and serious capital backing from both the private and public sectors. That skepticism is fair. Shipping might be 3% of global carbon emissions, but consider that these are massive, expensive vessels that typically have decades-long lifespans. If a shipping company invests in a new fleet of container ships designed for a certain type of fuel, it can't just scrap them a few years later. The cost would be astronomical, and the logistics of building brand new fleets would be similarly daunting. This new IMO deal aims to close what's often described as the cost gap, the difference between cheap fossil bunker fuel and more sustainable but pricier low or zero emission alternatives. The carrot and stick approach of stricter regulations on fuel carbon intensity plus a carbon penalty for excess emissions is designed to incentivize shipping lines to shift more quickly. The plan is that, over time, if enough operators adopt cleaner tech, the market will expand, prices will come down, and the entire sector will transition away from heavy fossil fuels. At least, that's the theory. One visible example of where these shifts could really show up is in the port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest seaport, which handles around 400 million tons of shipping cargo per year. It's trying to become a testing ground for sustainable shipping by piloting new fueling infrastructure. Rotterdam authorities have launched projects to provide onshore power so that ships can plug in and use clean electricity instead of running diesel generators at dockside. They've also been exploring how to accommodate vessels that run on liquefied natural gas or hydrogen. The theory is that if big ports set the standard and show it can work, others will follow suit. After all, ships go where the cargo is, so if major ports start requiring cleaner practices, shipping lines will adapt. But the big question remains: who pays the initial bill to put in fueling stations for these sustainable fuels? It's possible that as these new IMO rules take effect, the revenue from penalties on high-emission ships could be put toward building green port infrastructure. That's the idea behind what some call a global maritime fund, though the specifics of how that might be organised or distributed remain vague. Critics say the international community is still punting on the details, while supporters argue that the deal's broad strokes are a meaningful first step. It might be helpful to remember that these shipping negotiations took a decade, and that's not so surprising when we consider the dynamics. Shipping touches every corner of the globe. Countries have vastly different interests. For instance, small island nations are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. They want strong action, fast, because sea level rise and extreme weather events hit them the hardest. Large maritime nations with major registries, like Panama or the Marshall Islands, might rely on shipping fees as a key part of their economy. They worry about losing that business if strict rules get enforced. Then, you have industrial exporters like China, major importers like the United States, oil-producing nations, European countries pushing green policies, and so on. Coordinating all these perspectives into one international agreement is like herding cats across multiple continents. That's why, for many, it's a relief that we have a tangible deal at all. But it also helps explain why that deal is somewhat conservative. The fact that it exists is nothing short of a diplomatic miracle, but there's always this tension that it could be more ambitious. Many environmental watchdogs want to see steeper emission cuts in the near term, especially given that shipping volumes continue to grow as the global population and economy expand. If shipping traffic grows faster than efficiency gains, that 20% target might not actually bring about a meaningful net reduction in total carbon output. Then there's the anxiety that the industry could end up using bridging fuels, like liquefied natural gas, which are cleaner than heavy fuel oil but still produce greenhouse gases. Some argue that if we build a lot of LNG infrastructure now, it could lock us into decades of usage, making it harder to pivot again later to zero-carbon options such as green ammonia or hydrogen. Others point out that bridging fuels may be necessary simply because zero-carbon solutions on a huge scale aren't quite ready yet. We don't have the supply chains in place for green ammonia or hydrogen, and there are still safety and engineering challenges to address. For example, ammonia is toxic if spilled, so it's not exactly a risk-free solution. But a chunk of the shipping sector believes we can solve these technical challenges in the coming years if we're incentivized to do so by clear regulations and a meaningful carbon price. With all this debate, it's easy to see why there's both excitement and worry. Let's be real. The shipping industry has been burning dirty fuel for a long time, and many shipping lines got used to operating without strict global emissions constraints. The new IMO deal changes that equation. It signals that there's a regulatory wave coming, and if companies don't adapt, they'll soon be hit with penalty costs. Many shipping giants have already begun exploring new builds that can handle multiple fuel types, giving them some flexibility to switch to cleaner fuels if that becomes cost-effective. Others are investing in retrofits for existing vessels, adding things like wind assist technology. Yes, cargo ships with giant sails are making a comeback, kind of like a high-tech nod to the old days of clipper ships. Or installing air lubrication systems that reduce drag by creating a layer of microbubbles under the hull. Even small efficiency tweaks, like adjusting speed or route optimization with artificial intelligence, can reduce fuel consumption by 10 to 15%. Every bit helps. We also need to keep in mind that shipping is part of a broader climate puzzle. A common refrain is that to truly decarbonize shipping, we need a parallel push to clean up the entire energy supply chain. For example, if a ship burns hydrogen, that hydrogen should be produced from renewable electricity, green hydrogen, not from coal or gas. That means we need large-scale investment in renewables to ensure that shipping's alternative fuels are actually low carbon. Coordination between governments, energy producers, and the maritime industry is crucial. Critics sometimes argue that the new IMO deal places the onus heavily on shipping companies without fully addressing the broader energy infrastructure that must also transform. Despite the criticisms, many in the industry and policy circles see reasons for optimism. Some ports and shipping firms are going well beyond the minimum. We see companies placing orders for zero-carbon ships years before the regulations fully kick in, essentially betting that cleaner technology is the future and they might as well get ahead of the game. We see ports forming coalitions to create green corridors across major trade routes, promising that if a ship commits to cleaner fuel, these ports will ensure they have somewhere to tank up. The hope is that this synergy will create a self-reinforcing cycle, where the more zero-carbon ships are built, the more the infrastructure for those fuels will appear, and as that infrastructure grows, more companies will feel comfortable investing in new ships. Over time, the cost gap should shrink, and eventually it may become just as cheap to run a green ship as a dirty one. This is where Synergy International comes in, with our sense of pragmatic optimism. We've seen firsthand that industries can and do change when the right combination of regulation, market signals, and technological advancements converge. We know how easy it is to be jaded if you look only at the final agreement, with all its imperfections and compromises. But the shipping sector hasn't historically been regulated on emissions the way road transport has, so this is effectively a brand new chapter. From our perspective, locking in incremental progress has real merit. By solidifying these 2028 and 2030 targets, we set a bar that raises the industry's baseline. Even if it's not as high as some would like, it creates a stable platform to push off from in the future. We also see this as a catalyst that can unleash business opportunities. Shipbuilders, engine manufacturers, and fuel innovators will find new markets in this transformation. Financial institutions will offer green bonds or favourable loans for zero-emission vessels. Some shipping lines will brand themselves as climate forward, appealing to customers who care about a cleaner supply chain. The integration among regulation, innovation, and consumer demand has the potential to make sustainable shipping not only viable but more profitable over time. That doesn't mean we expect smooth sailing. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Turning this vision into reality requires further progress on infrastructure, technology, and global enforcement. One big challenge is ensuring that all countries step up equally. The IMO sets the rules, but individual nations need to implement them. If some choose not to enforce or drag their feet, shipping could find ways around the regulation by registering vessels under flags of convenience. Or big ports might adopt strict rules, but smaller ports with fewer resources might not. That could create an unlevel playing field. It's going to take ongoing international collaboration to shore up these gaps. The good news is that the direction of travel is set. Once a major regulator lays out a path, we typically see the momentum build. The shipping industry certainly isn't shy about investing when it knows the rules won't shift overnight. The newly introduced penalties are a clue that the world is serious about shipping's climate footprint. So, while the cynics might say it's too little too late, we see a chance to build and refine this agreement over time. Many believe the 2030 target could be revised upward in a few years if enough countries and companies prove it can be met. In other words, these targets might not be static. Think of them as a dynamic framework, subject to ratcheting up. The initial step is to establish any kind of global standard. Then, as technology costs fall and public opinion shifts, it becomes easier to push that standard higher. That's partly why SYNI International and numerous other advocates are supporting the carrot and stick approach. Closing the cost gap is crucial. Between the carbon penalty, the global emissions cap, and support for research, we believe shipping can unlock the financing needed to scale zero-emission fuels. The big question is how quickly that scale can be reached. We're focused on encouraging robust public-private partnerships so that shipping lines, fuel suppliers, and governments share the cost burden and pool resources to build the fueling systems of tomorrow. That can happen in major ports like Rotterdam or Singapore, but it also needs to filter out to developing ports worldwide, ensuring no region is left behind. Given all this, we recognise there are good reasons for both scepticism and hope. There's an urgency to decarbonise shipping because 3% of global carbon emissions is no small sum, and it's expected to increase if left unchecked. At the same time, shipping is notoriously complex, with thousands of ships, countless ports, and a wide array of stakeholders. Expecting a perfect solution straight out of the gate would be unrealistic. Instead, we're seeing a painstaking process of incremental consensus building, technology demonstration, and policy calibration. It might not look flashy, but if it systematically ratchets down emissions, then we're on the right course. It's a bit like steering a supertanker. Slow to start, but once it's on a new trajectory, it's tough to stop. With new policies that require large commercial ships to meet fuel standards by 2028, a penalty of $380 per tonne for emissions over the limit, and a declared aim to cut emissions 20% by 2030, the shipping industry finds itself at the dawn of real transformation. Yes, there's ample debate on whether that transformation is robust enough or adequately funded. Critics claim the investment gap is so big that this new deal is more symbolic than solution-oriented. Others see it as the clearest signal yet that shipping's dirty secret is coming to an end. SYNI International's take is that sometimes the best way to drive larger transformations is through smaller steps that become entrenched in the industry's fabric. Once the foundation is laid, we can keep building layer by layer until shipping becomes a genuinely green part of global commerce. We'll be watching closely to see how shipping lines respond and whether ports ramp up infrastructure quickly enough to support new fuels. We're also keeping an eye on potential leadership from big importers and exporters whose purchasing decisions can tilt the scales. After all, if major retailers decide they only want goods moved on cleaner vessels, or if large financial institutions restrict capital for high-emission ships, that amplifies the impact of the IMO regulations. The beauty of this sector is that everyone is interlinked. If a port invests in green bunkering, if shipbuilders roll out a new class of low-emission vessels, if operators fine-tune their routes to minimize fuel burn, we can collectively reduce shipping's carbon footprint. That's our global route forward. It's an exciting, if sometimes frustrating, time for sustainable shipping. But we think it's a challenge worth tackling because the stakes are enormous. When we reduce emissions from shipping, we're not only cleaning up the air for port communities, we're also helping stabilize the global climate. Meanwhile, new technologies, new ship designs, and new infrastructures can spark economic opportunities in the maritime sector. Our goal is to stay optimistic, yet realistic. We absolutely should acknowledge the scale of the challenges and the many question marks surrounding who pays for this transition and how quickly it can be done. Yet we also see promising signals that with the right mix of policy, innovation, and market demand, shipping can pivot away from being a climate problem toward being part of the solution. And so, dear listeners, whether you're an industry insider, a climate advocate, or simply someone intrigued by what makes the modern world's supply chains tick, I hope this exploration of the shipping industry's new decarbonisation push has given you food for thought. While the agreement may not be perfect, it's a reminder that even the most entrenched sectors can change course when enough pressure, regulation, technology, and collaboration come together. The next few years will be crucial to see if this plan is enacted effectively, if the funding materialises to upgrade ports and fleets, and if the 2030 and 2050 targets end up being the floor or the ceiling. If we get it right, we'll cut a meaningful chunk out of global emissions and show that massive seafaring cargo vessels can be part of a cleaner, more sustainable future. Well, that's a wrap on our 16th GreenWave podcast episode. We appreciate you sharing more of your time today. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. So feel free to follow the pod and share with friends. Leave a 5-star review. That will help grow the pod. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the latest GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability, one shipping lane at a time.